Okay, sweet. Thanks guys for coming. We didn't realize that, yeah, Ignite has their stuff on tonight, but that's all right. Just means you can ask more questions if you need. But otherwise we'll be going through like hemostasis and coagulation, which is basically like a small look at like our blood stuff. So we're going to look at the process of hemostasis first. So I think like last week or so, we kind of went through like different parts of our blood. And now we'll be looking at when our blood stops flowing. So we're forming clots and that kind of thing. So every time, like if you fall down or something and you're bleeding, your blood is going to clot up so that you don't bleed to death. And that comes as a result of a few processes. So it comes as a result from your platelets and your fibroblasts. So these help with clotting and forming the structures there. And then proteins help kind of trigger this process. So you have a few coagulation factors, inhibitors, and some extracellular matrix proteins, which kind of help to form that structure. Yeah, so we're kind of trying to plug the hole to stop bleeding out. So the first step of this is what we call the primary platelet plug. Primary platelet plug. So this is the first step. So what happens is, say if we fall down, so we've damaged some of our endothelium or some of the cells that line our blood vessels. And as a result, we get these thrombogenic substances that are kind of released and exposed. So as the name kind of suggests, thrombogenic means that we're going to be forming a thrombus or something that kind of stops the flow. And as a result of that, that'll start our process. We'll also get platelets. In the bloodstream, kind of rolling along the endothelium, and these will adhere to the extracellular matrix. And so these kind of help to build up our structure slowly. And then after that, we activate our platelets. Our platelets will also join together and form bridges. And this whole kind of structure being built up results in our primary platelet plug. So this is like a very temporary solution, I guess. Because after this, we have something called secondary hemostasis. And this gives a bit more strength to our structure. So once our PPP is finished, or our primary platelet plug, we have secondary hemostasis. And basically what secondary hemostasis is that it's basically a bunch of cells and a bunch of fibrin that forms over this primary platelet plug. So our triple P provides the template for how these cells are going to form, and it works with these coagulation factor enzymes in order to create a really firm and stable plug. So it's really strengthening, this barrier to stop blood flow. Okay, so for this whole process, we basically need some coagulation factors, which are kind of like steps in, they're kind of steps that occur in order for everything to stick together. And the main things that we need to remember is that vitamin K is really important, and it's required for coagulation factors 2, 7, 9, and 10. These factors can kind of be remembered through our TV channels. So channel 2, which is like ABC, channel 7, channel 9, and channel 10. So 2, 7, 9, and 10. 2, 7, 9, and 10 are really, really important. And we basically we'll have a flow chart in the coming slides that'll show us a few pathways we can take. So this is the pathway you'll see in the slides. And this pathway, you'll need to remember this pathway essentially. So we have intrinsic pathway and then extrinsic pathway, and these join together to form the common pathway. So our intrinsic pathway comes from any blood vessel damage, whereas our extrinsic pathway comes from any tissue damage. So a good way to remember this is kind of thinking where we find our blood vessels and where we find our tissue. Tissue is found mostly on the outside, so that's our extrinsic, whereas our blood vessels are found inside, so that's our intrinsic. Yep, I don't really know what to say about this pathway, except that you need to remember it. the A's next to all these numbers, they represent the activated form. So in reality, how it actually goes is 12 turns into 12A, 12A will activate 11 turning into 11A, 11A will cause 9 to turn into 9A, and so forth. And we get this huge kind of cascade down into this common pathway, which will happen no matter the source of injury. Yeah. Commit this one to memory. This one's important. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the common pathway now, and the last couple of steps in there. And essentially what is happening is that we have a molecule called fibrinogen, and this is our number 1. And this is cleaved, or it's cut by thrombin, which is 2A. And this fibrinogen will turn into fibrin monomers, or soluble fibrin monomers. These are 1A. So you can see that here. So thrombin, thrombin here will turn into, will kind of like cut our fibrinogen into fibrin. So we're looking at this lower part of forming the stable clot. And after we form these bunch of monomers, a ton of these monomers are going to join together, and that's going to form this huge network of fibrin. And after it's formed, it's going to be solidified by factor 8A. by factor 8A. So that creates crosslinks. It makes it more solid. Just forms a stable clot, as the name suggests. But after we formed our clot, we don't want our clot to remain there forever, because after a while our tissue will regenerate, we'll be able to heal all of that up, and then we can get rid of this clot. So the opposite process to forming a clot is called fibrinolysis. So this is the process of removing it, so it doesn't keep enlarging and it doesn't cause any problems. What happens is that the fibrin, or the stable clot, will express these receptors called profibrinolytic receptors. And what happens is that we have a few activators, our tissue plasminogen activators and our urokinase plasminogen activators. And these will activate plasminogen to form plasmin. And our plasmin will dissolve our fibrin. So we basically have a bunch of activators that form plasmin, and this plasmin will dissolve our clot and get rid of it. And as a result, our clot will result in XY, DE, and D dimers. These are all separate. So we can actually measure these things to tell how our clotting is doing. We also have a few PAI 1 and 2. So PAI 1 and 2 stands for plasminogen activator inhibitor. So it inhibits the plasminogen activator. And our plasminogen activator is the same one that we find here. So our inhibitors will stop the action of TPA and UPA, and therefore our clot will remain there and it won't get broken down. Does that make sense? Yeah, all right, sweet. Okay, cool. So yeah, so as I was saying, we can test our ability to clot things. And we can do this through a few tests. You don't need to know too much of them, really. Just know the names of them and kind of which stage they test. So we have prothrombin time, which tests extrinsic pathway and the common pathway. Then we have the activated partial thromboplastin time, or APTT, which does the other side of things, so the intrinsic and common. Then our thrombin time does our stable clot. And then we can measure our D dimer, or our fibrinogen, to tell similar things, how well we're clotting our blood. We can also look at our platelets to see if they're working well, and we can also measure our coagulation factors. So essentially, to see how well we're forming clots, we can do that through measuring a bunch of things that are involved with the whole process. And depending on their levels, we can tell whether our clotting function is doing well or if it's not doing so well. If it's not doing so well, we might have some disorders. And those disorders, you'll get either too much or too little sometimes. But the main one we kind of look at is the inability to clot. So we might bleed too much, perhaps after surgery or from our joints due to some trauma, or we might have purple discoloration, but that's not bruising, it's just due to you not being able to clot well. And you might get some hematomas, which is like a buildup of blood. So yeah, we've kind of been through we've been through the clotting process, dissolving the clot, and then how to measure it, and then what goes wrong. Here's another thing that goes wrong, where we have thrombosis. And this is where we form a clot, but then it goes through our circulation. And as a result of it going through our circulation, it can get stuck at certain points, and it will basically block off our blood supply, which is not so good. So the prime example that I think a lot of people know is a stroke. So during a stroke, you're going to block the blood supply to a brain, and in doing so, your brain's not going to get the necessary blood supply, and you're going to lose a lot of function there. Another one is deep vein thrombosis, just like when you're on a plane for too long, and you lose blood supply to your leg. And we have an important triad called Virchow's triad, which affects our thrombosis. And this is endothelial injury. So if we injure our blood vessels, if we have abnormal blood flow, so this might be your heart not pumping correctly. So as a result of this, your platelets are going to hit the walls of our endothelium more. And then we might have abnormal coagulation. So we might have too many coagulation factors or incorrect activation. Okay, so that was on the blood side of things, but then we'll consider the tissue side of things. But do you guys have any questions about the blood stuff, or is that pretty okay? I'm gonna guess it's okay. Okay. So we've talked about our blood kind of dealing with injury, and now we'll talk about our cells. So our cells basically have to change in order to the stimuli that it's getting. So for example, if you're holding on to a lot of heavy things quite often, you're going to start to develop calluses. So like a lot of people who do gymnastics will get these thickening of cells. And that's kind of like a response to a certain stressor that's placed on our cells. And these changes can either be physiological, so perhaps hormone secretion might change, or it can be pathological. So it's abnormal stress that causes these changes. So we'll kind of go through this flow chart here and kind of how cells move around according to this. So a cell is normally in homeostasis, and if it's put under a little bit of stress, then it'll change a bit. But if it's unable to change, then it'll get injured. It'll also get injured if you get an injury, obviously. And then depending on how bad the cell injury is, it might be reversible or irreversible. So for example, if you fall over, for example, that's a reversible injury. So your cells will recover and they'll return back to their normal cells. But let's say if, I don't know, you crash your car and you injure yourself pretty badly, that's going to cause an irreversible injury, and this could result in cell death. So your body could voluntarily kill cells off in order to improve their condition, or they might necrose so uncontrolled cell death. So either way, it's not a great thing. However, we still prefer apoptosis over necrosis. I'll answer questions after we finish this, after this section. So I think someone mentioned, I think we presented on this last time, but we were talking about redness, swelling, heat, pain, and loss of function, or the Latin ruber, tumor, calor, dumor, and functio lacer. But basically all of these signs, all of these signs are things, all of these signs are things that you'll see if your cells are stressed out and you get injured and that kind of thing. So for example, yeah, once again, if you fall over, your knee gets really red, it swells a bit maybe, feels a bit warm, you're in pain, and you probably won't be able to use your knee as well. Like you probably can't go running 5 minutes later. So we might see all of these signs when we injure ourselves. And as a result, just like in the flowchart, it will either be reversible or irreversible, depending on how bad it is. And if they're reversible, we'll get something called tissue regeneration or adaptation. However, if it's irreversible, we get tissue repair, which is kind of, we kill off some of the cells and then we form an abnormal type of cell, which is how we get scars. So we'll go through like regeneration and adaptation. But essentially regeneration and adaptation are good. We're either replacing them with our normal cells or we're making better cells, whereas our repair will result in just scar tissue, which is just fibrous, not very useful. Yeah, it's just not good. We can also name these in different ways: hypertrophy, hyperplasia, atrophy, and metaplasia. So hypertrophy is increasing your cell and organ size. So like if you go to the gym, for example, to work out, your muscles or your different organs will increase in size, as well as your muscle cells. So those will also increase in size. You may also get a bit of hyperplasia. Yep. You might get a bit of hyperplasia as well, which is you'll increase the number of cells. So this might be an increase in the number of muscle cells you have. However, if you don't go to the gym for a long time, if you're not eating enough, things like that, you're going to get atrophy. And this is basically a decreasing in cell and organ size. So you get weaker if you don't go to the gym, things like that. So that might be right now for some people. And then metaplasia is changes in cell morphology. And this is basically changing our cell structure, it's changing our cell shape. These tend to be a bit abnormal and we don't really want them too much. Okay, and we have a few factors that'll affect what type of response we get. So it'll change whether we get like our regeneration or repair, things like that. And it depends on three things. It depends on the amount of damage. So have we just given ourselves like a paper cut, or have we chopped our whole finger off, for example? It also depends on the type of tissue. So some tissues are naturally able to regenerate more than others. So we can classify these as labile, stable, or permanent. And it's kind of on 3 different levels. So labile things, they're always making new cells, and therefore we're going to be able to repair them really nicely. Stable ones are like, they'll proliferate a bit, but they won't do it so often, but they can if they need to. And then permanent ones, these ones, once you make them, you can't remake them. So these can't repair at all. So for example, an example of a permanent tissue might be your kidneys. So if you damage your kidneys, you can't remake them. It's not possible. An example of stable is a pancreas. So it can regenerate a tiny bit, but not a whole ton. So those are two of our factors, our amount of damage and the type of tissue. And then the last one is our duration of injury. So how long have we let this injury go on for before we're kind of seeking treatment? Or over what time period are we injuring ourselves? So depending on these three factors, we're going to change our ability to recover from the injury. So you can see here, it's nicely summarized based on regenerate, which is kind of the good one, versus repair, which is the scar tissue. So if you have a huge injury, you're probably going to form a fairly large scar. If your tissue can't regenerate, you're going to form a scar. And if you get the injury over a long period of time and it keeps on occurring, you're going to get a scar. And then the opposite for regenerating the original cells. So this table is fairly useful. It basically summarizes up the last couple of slides in like a relevant form. So what we can see here is histology. It's a lot of pink. I think the main thing to take from here is, if you look at the left, a normal pancreas looks lots of purple dots, a lot of pink. It looks pretty okay. And then if we compare the normal one to this alcoholic chronic pancreatitis, which is going to be a long-term injury. A long-term injury or a chronic injury is going to result in repair with fibrous scar tissue. And we can see that all along here, which kind of doesn't have any of those purple dots anymore. So that's abnormal, and that's no good. Okay. And if we have an irreversible cell injury, we're going to get necrosis and apoptosis. I think you guys have talked about this before, either that or in bio if you've done it. So apoptosis is controlled cell death, whereas necrosis is uncontrolled cell death. So apoptosis, really, really good. You don't form anything bad from it. It's a natural process. Whereas necrosis, you release a bunch of toxins, everything gets red and angry and not great. Just a bad time. And this can come from a few things, like, I don't know, slamming your finger in a door. That'll be an example of a mechanical injury. Yeah, losing blood supply to a certain part of your body would also result in necrosis. So anything bad, anything abnormal results in necrosis, whereas apoptosis is all good. A small bit called a reperfusion injury. So this is like, say if you're wearing a ring, right? And for some reason your ring is way too tight and it gets stuck on your finger. And as a result, you're going to lose blood supply to your finger. So you might think that like suddenly cutting off the ring and bringing back blood really, really quickly is a good idea. But it actually might not be, because the sudden restoration of blood can actually injure your cells. And that can cause a bunch of reactive oxygen species or a bunch of bad oxygen ions to be formed. And that results in a bad time. It results in necrosis. So we call it an ischemia reperfusion injury. So we've originally lacked oxygen supply, and then we reperfused or reprovided the blood supply, and that results in an injury. Yeah. And that's thought to be due to like damaging a mitochondria. Cool. I think I got a question about if we have a problem with clotting, why would it occur? Why would muscle hematomas form? I think it's just like the blood will, it'll just clot where it's not meant to. So like your muscles get such a huge blood supply, right? When they're contracting, that kind of thing. And if it's getting a lot of blood supply, you could get some abnormal clotting in there. So that could result in a hematoma. Yeah. Okay. RJ is going to tell us a bit about exercise and mindfulness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hold on. Okay, so for exercise and mindfulness, it's not too much that you have to know. There's a few key stats that I've summarized in the first few slides. So there was a study which was done, which they like to test quite often. So individuals who are most likely inactive is just the four main categories: women, um, non-English speakers. So it's English as an additional language or English as a second language. Low education and low SES have children under 5. This is not always the case, but it was just a study that was done. And there's another key stat, which is also Craig Hassett likes to test, is that 70% of Australians above 15 are classified as sedentary. And you have to get the idea of that there's also an optimal level of exercise. So after a certain point, if you exercise too much, it can actually cause detrimental health effects to your health. Okay, so there's certain guidelines that you need to follow. Again, these these key stats. You need to hit 60 to 70% of your VO2 max, and you need to guidelines is around 3 to 7 times a day. And for specific diseases, aerobic exercises is good for everything. So I have a table later on which you can see, and you need to know the differences for the different types of exercises. So most exercises you just need aerobic is good for those exercises, but there are certain exercises which are not so good for those specific diseases. So like resistance is good for osteoporosis and strength. And for cancer, only aerobic exercises should be used and not balance and strength training. Is there any questions? Oh, okay. Okay. So going on to different types of exercises. So aerobic is just basically like cardio, any running. Resistance is weight training, and balance is to train your flexibility, like yoga, Pilates. And this is the table that I was talking about. So you really should know this table. And the main thing that you should take note is that most diseases require, like in most diseases, aerobic exercises actually improve um, the condition and can help to improve the prognosis. But for cancer as well as dementia, resistance and balance training is not recommended. Yeah. Okay. Another thing to take note of is that he put in this slide. He has put in his slide something about the Grim Reaper speed of walk. So basically, there's been studies shown that individuals who walk less than 1.36 miles per second have increased mortality. So if you have to walk at a faster speed than 1.36 miles per second. And yeah, so again, exercise, the benefit increases with increasing activity, but it plateaus over a certain period. You don't have to know this number, but basically, again, you don't need to know all of these details. It's all in his slides, but it's just to show that if you exercise way too much, it just there's no additional benefit. And another important thing is that which you might be tested on is perceived barriers to exercise. So many people tend to overlook exercise due to a few reasons. Lack of time is a common reason, lack of motivation, lack of money. And another important thing is physical injuries and conditions which limit their movement, and as well as convenience. So all of these are perceived barriers that are not necessarily, they can easily be overcome if they actually set their mind to it and actually use use SMART goals. But these are just perceived barriers. Yeah, and that's basically it for exercise. It's quite a short section for this week. Any questions? Oh yeah, sorry, meters, not miles. Yeah.
Yeah, not miles. Okay. We're just thinking. We didn't realize so many people would be at Ignite. So I don't know. Should we postpone? Should we postpone our how to study thing? Because I feel like it'd be better on another night.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Yeah. What do you guys?
There's more trivia this
no,
weekend.
There's
That's fine.
2024. There's the 2024 trivia.
We
this
love
weekend,
trivias
right?
though. Yeah, we love trivias.
Right. That's institute trivia.
We can just do it next week. It's
Yeah, you
fine.
can combine it with week 10, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What's week 10 stuff?
Let's see.
Skills Friday night. Yeah, I think we can just rebrand it a little